welcome back to the new and improved video version of the High Tech Forum podcast. We've done a little hiatus as we kind of recalibrated our approach to this. Today, we're very lucky to have Thomas Johnson, or do I call you Tom?
Tom's fine.
The General Counsel at the Federal Communications Commission. And Tom served in that position for a couple of years now and has an extensive background in telecom law and is, I think, doing a great job as General Counsel. I always read, his major filings and find the reasoning really quite lucid and quite comprehensive. And we're going to talk about one of those, at least one of those today. So, Tom, I thing that sort of triggered me to invite you to do a podcast was the op-ed you wrote in the Washington Post recently about how 5G health fears are threatening the recovery. So why'd you do that?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me on, Richard. It's great to be here. My interest in that topic really originated from a roundtable discussion that I had in New York City back in February, back when we were permitted to do such things. It seems like a lifetime ago now, unfortunately. But we had a discussion about a lot of the efforts that the FCC were taking in order to roll out and streamline regulations to incentivize the deployment of next generation 5G networks. And one thing that was very interesting to me, especially having grown up in northern New Jersey, was I heard that a lot of resistance in the New York and New Jersey area to 5G deployment was coming from the local level based on perceived health concerns about radio frequency emissions, so cell phone and cell tower emissions. And what someone in the audience asked is, what can we be doing? What more can we be doing? What more can the FCC be doing to get out the message that this technology is safe? We have this phenomenon in New Jersey and probably elsewhere within the country of boroughitis. It developed during the time when trains were connecting the suburbs to New York City, and every mile or so there was a new incorporated town. So you have, I think, over 500 municipal gatekeepers in New Jersey alone, and a lot of the providers need to go town by town to get the necessary approvals. And all of that takes time, all of that takes money, and it's particularly difficult when you have misinformation about the potential health effects of 5G. And so just to give a sort of an overview, we are charged by federal law, the Communications Act and the National Environmental Protection Act to look at equipment that emits radio frequency emissions, communications equipment, and to put in place procedures to have equipment providers certify that essentially that those products are safe. And so we have testing procedures, we have limits based on the best available scientific evidence, input from sister agencies like the FDA and the CDC to make sure that these devices are safe for consumer use.
Well, and that's how we get the little FCC sticker on our phones. That's what it means, right? The device has been tested and approved.
Right, absolutely right. And what happened was, as just luck would have it, shortly after I came back from that roundtable, a federal court in California invited us to file a statement of interest in a case that they had out there that was being brought by a potential class action of people who use Apple's iPhone, arguing that the iPhone exceeded the RF limits, the FCC's RF limits under certain circumstances. And what turned out to have happened there is that the plaintiffs and the lawyers in that case had done third-party tests that did not rely upon the FCC's protocols, that weren't done under the procedures that the FCC requires. Yeah. The Chicago Tribune ran an article talking about this case. We put our expert engineers on it. We tried to replicate those findings. We couldn't. What we found was that then when we tested the equipment under our procedures, they passed the test just as they did, at the outset before they were certified for consumer use.
Huh.
And so
Well,
what,
I've noticed there's a disclaimer, I think, in Apple's statement about their RF emissions that cautions that if people put the phone inside a case that has a metal component, it could alter the emission characteristics. Is that what happened there?
Well, I think what happened there is that you had private parties who were using their own testing protocols, and frankly, I'm not sure that we were able to discern exactly how they went wrong, other than to say that when you used our testing protocols, the consumer device is checked out, because there are all sorts of things in terms of default settings, in terms of where you're holding the device, all the things that you mentioned.
Well, yeah, I mean, how you do the certification, how you do the testing is in many cases just as important as what the limits are. And what I've noticed, I mean, I've personally been really engaged in the what I call the 5G truther movement for the last few months, because they're active in the city where I live, in Lakewood, Colorado, and I'm really interested in seeing the city, execute on the updates to the codes that are required really to permit the fast rollout of 5G small cells. Because I worked as an SGE on the development of the BDAC model municipal code back in, I guess, 2017, when right after Chairman Pai, set up the BDAC, and people went to work on state, local, and other matters. And so to hear, I mean, of course, the codes that we came up with were sort of incorporated into an order that the agency issued, and where I think there was some congressional action around those things as well. But what I've noticed is the issue of replication, that seems to be a problem that's characteristic throughout all of the alternative science that the 5G truthers have. They've, the basic theory about cell phone safety is that the thing that we need to be concerned about is thermal effects of RF emissions, and all the testing that is done by the evaluations that are done by IEEE Standards Association, by the European Union, by the other agencies in Europe and Asia that work on setting emission limits that are safe for the use of cell phones. They're all based on setting a SAR, a specific absorption limit that is consistent with not producing any unwanted effects in the body. And these things must be working pretty well, because the American Cancer Society, according to their statistics, the rate of brain cancer is actually somewhat less today than it was in 1990, before we all started using wireless devices. And it's reasonable that if there were some sort of link between radio frequency emission and cancer, that it would show up in the brain, because we hold the devices up to our ear, and there's no bone. There's a little pathway there where signals can get directly into the brain. But in fact, some of the research, the Danish study shows that people who are heavy users of cell phones actually have a lower rate of brain cancer than people who aren't. So that theory, I mean, there's no health issue in terms of the most obvious place that you would find it if it were real. So they've invented 4 or 5 different alternative theories about non-thermal effects. But the research on that is so interesting, because nobody has ever been able to replicate a finding. Some people do studies and they say, look, see, I found this and it's really scary. I put a magnet next to a petri dish and it made the blood curdle or something. But nobody can replicate those findings. And sound science is based on not just somebody writes one paper one time that addresses one issue. It's like, yeah, somebody writes a paper, somebody else does the same test, gets the same result. And, and it's sort of the accumulation of independent verification that makes this stuff work. But when you can't even replicate somebody says, well, we tested it and it was X, and it's like, well, when I tested it's X over 2. So I don't think you're right.
Right. No, and I think you raise a very important practical problem, which is that you really can't make policy in this area by relying on all of these different individual kind of private studies, some of which, as you say, have problems in terms of controlling for variables, that have problems in terms of scaling up from a test on a mouse, exposed to 75 times the amount of radiation over the full body that a cell phone might temporarily expose someone to against the ear. And so all sorts of confounding potential problems. And the reason why this matters is because you really can't have decisions being made about regional and national networks based on a million, different studies, a million different court decisions, like in this Apple case, applying different standards. I mean, and that's part of the argument that we made before the court there, is that this is an area in which Congress has given us and our expert engineers, as well as other health and safety agencies in the federal government, a role to look at all these studies, evaluate these studies, and to come up with standards that will enable the build out of these networks across the country while also keeping consumers safe. I mean, and you mentioned WHO and the EU, and our standards are actually quite conservative by comparison to other global standards. I mean, with respect to thermal effects, which you mentioned, for example, I mean, we build in a safety factor of 50 times that which would be required in order to heat human tissue. And that just points to the danger of trying to rely on a study in which a small animal is exposed for its entire life over the entire body in a confined space to many times the amount of radiation that comes from a cell phone. I mean, we have no idea the stress that might be involved, the thermal temperature increase involved. All of that stuff could be accounting for what's observed. That's why we have to rely, as you pointed out, on these much broader epidemiological studies that are much more reliable. Whereas you say, when you look at the population that has used cell phones over the course of the evolution from 3G to 4G to 5G, and so we can look at that population. It's a pretty large percentage of the American people. And if we're not seeing statistically significant increases in cancer rates, in fact, if we're seeing the opposite, it's fairly strong evidence that there isn't a correlation between RF emissions in any so-called non-thermal health effects.
Yeah. I saw an interesting survey that said that about 15% of Americans believe that cell phones cause cancer, but they use them anyway.
Yeah, and this is nothing new. I mean, you talk about the 5G truther movement, and dating back to the advent of AM and FM radio, there were stories in the New York Times saying that birds killed mid-flight by radio emissions. I mean, there has been this type of hysteria dating way back when. We have 100 years of experience now with dealing with using the radio waves to communicate. And
November is actually the 100th anniversary of the first AM radio station, and it was in Pittsburgh, I think.
Well, there you go. Yeah. So I mean, we have these milestones, and we're approaching yet another huge revolution, as you know, in wireless technology with 5G networks. And the irony,
and it's not even just RF. I mean, there was the same sort of freak out about the electrical grid.
Sure.
Right. The IARC, the international agency that evaluates hazard rather than risk. I mean, risk is what we care about. Hazard is whether something can be dangerous under any circumstances. The New York Times explained that pretty well in terms of, we know sharks are a hazard, but, they're not a risk if you don't swim in shark-infested waters. But, they say that extra low frequency, which is what power lines emit, is a, you know, is a cancer hazard, probable cancer hazard, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, and the irony here is, we've put in all of this work. We just concluded a proceeding in late 2019 that looked at the last kind of 20 years of medical evidence and
Mm-hmm.
developments, continued to conclude that our current RF emissions were sufficient to protect the public. And the
Mm-hmm.
irony is that people, the 5G truther movement, they're actually going to impair, American health outcomes across the country because,
Yeah.
especially, if you look at what we have needed from our networks during COVID-19, right? I mean, you have people who are locked in their houses, people who are isolated and depressed, people who need attention, need medical care, people who need access to education and increasingly utilizing the online classroom. And we're relying more and more on our home networks to provide telehealth, to provide education,
Mm-hmm.
to just provide connection to our friends and
Yeah.
families
Oh, yeah.
now. And
I
so
mean, it's literally a lifeline.
Absolutely, and
Yeah.
the promise of 5G, as I know you know very well, Richard, from having worked on Wi-Fi. I mean, the promise of 5G is all of that additional capacity, speed, low latency that is going to make real-time applications like remote medicine, like drone delivery, like autonomous vehicles and the like, much more of a reality. And so the use cases for it, the potential health benefits to the American public for it, the impact on our economy, and an estimated over 200 million new jobs, $3 trillion in GDP,
Mm-hmm.
something like $13 trillion in retail sales. I mean, we need that more than ever. And so it's only counterproductive if you have people going around there spreading needless anxiety about the health risks of 5G and slowing down deployment.
Did you read my blog today? Because you just quoted the exact numbers that I had for the economic forecast for the.
I did read your blog
Okay.
today. Yeah, I'm
Yeah,
sorry
yeah.
for not citing it. Yeah,
No, that's all right.
but
I mean, I
but
got it from an IHS report where they said actually 5G, they expect by 2035, 5G will enable $13 trillion worth of sales. I mean, it doesn't mean contribution to the GDP, but sales enablement of like 13 trillion by 2035, and tons of jobs and lots of direct output. I mean, from direct, the 5G value chain. It's really kind of staggering. I mean, when I look at
absolutely
5G, it's like, as you said, I've got a background in Wi-Fi. I was one of the people that started developing the initial architecture and standards in 1990. If we'd had the tools we had today, I think we would have built 5G instead of Wi-Fi. I mean, the thing was, it's, as a technologist, you always have to compromise. Every engineering creation is a compromise because you've got to deal with performance and security and price. And, if we could just do triple the price of everything, we could have like a whole lot better gear, but, then nobody'd be able to use it. And it's just such an amazing thing because you get the computation at the edge of the network. So you can do these extremely rapid response things like collision avoidance in cars.
right.
And the application, the one single application that really kind of speaks to me most is the connected ambulance.
Hmm.
So somebody has an accident or a health incident, the EMTs go to pick them up. And there's at least 3 different countries that are trialing this right now, where they have an ambulance that has a sonogram scanner, um, maybe an MRI machine, and some other diagnostic equipment that you normally, would be in the emergency room. But you don't have doctors in ambulances because it just, I guess, the cost is too much. But they beam this info back to a doctor who's multitasking, and he figures out exactly what they need to do to prep the patient for whatever surgery is going to be needed when they get to the hospital, and it, like, reduces the response time, and it's just an amazing thing. So we can have things like that, or else we can have an attempt to kind of placate the fears of people who are just, I think, technology hesitant people in general. What I found in looking at the 5G truthers is they tend to be people who have a background in opposition to vaccines, opposition to things like genetically engineered foods, and it's just sort of technology. The pace of change that's triggered by new technology, I think, is unsettling to a lot of people. And so there's this desire to kind of return to a golden age when life was simple and, you know, um, it was all great, and, put all this technology aside. But, that golden age, I don't think it ever really existed, right? I mean, 1900, before we had wide scale electricity and telephone networks, the life expectancy in the US was about 40 years. And, now it's double that. And of
Right.
course, there are lots of reasons for that. But, almost all of those reasons have some sort of connection to technology. I mean, we have cleaner water, we have better sanitation, we have a more abundant food supply, we have better health care, we have vaccines, we have, all these things that sort of add up to, like, well, really, if your life expectancy is 40, that doesn't sound very golden to me.
Right, and I mean, you mentioned, the hospital use case for 5G, and we had different providers come in and sort of put on a show of some of the potential technologies in development at the FCC.
Mm,
At some point, I think it was last year, and it was just amazing to see from virtual reality goggles that would be used to treat symptoms like anxiety or depression,
mm-hmm.
or
Oh,
even
yeah, yeah.
things like
Mm-hmm.
aversion to public speaking. They had an app that essentially either simulated kind of a hostile crowd or a friendly crowd,
Uh-huh.
and you could
Yeah.
practice giving a speech to either of them. They had on the public safety side, they had apps that sort of simulated cities, and where you could sort of look at fires from above the skyscraper, sort of see where your first responders were, see what the traffic patterns were in the
Hmm.
city, and all of that information could be
Yeah,
combined
reroute them so they get there
time
quickest. Yeah.
exactly to
Mm-hmm.
get first responders to emergencies quicker. So you have all these use cases, and as you say, with each new generation of technology, certainly people are going to raise concerns. Certainly we need people with the right background, the right expertise to look at these issues to make sure that concerns about consumer safety, concerns about transparency, and making sure that people are informed about potential risks or about how technology works. We need to make sure we have these things in place. But at the end of the day, the use cases for these things are ultimately, as you say, going to lead to longer, healthier lives, and more and easier connectivity, particularly during times of crisis like we're experiencing
Mm.
now.
Yeah, it makes it a lot easier to put up temporary networks and to shift capacity around when the 5G is mostly going to be a software defined network. So if you need more capacity in a certain area, it's like somebody at a console could just make it happen without, even going out and doing any civil engineering and construction. I think you raised what I think is probably the single most important point about this is that actually 5G is, by every physiological assessment, the safest wireless network that we've ever deployed. And the reason for that is the power levels that are necessary to move a signal over a short distance are much lower than the power levels needed to move a signal over a long distance. And so when the small cell that my home, the devices in my home connect to is in my front yard, then it's essentially like another Wi-Fi access point in terms of the exposure. And people don't realize that as much as 10,000 times of the radio frequency emissions the body absorbs from the cellular network actually come from the phone. But
Right.
the truthers are all focused on the towers because, you drive by a tower and it's like, wow, that looks like, that must be a lot of power up there. That's really scary. but in fact, it's because of the dissipation of radio frequency energy over distance. It's like to the fourth power of the distance, the degradation in the signal strength. There's virtually almost no detectable signal, that enters your body from the tower itself. It's all from the local personal devices, not just your phone, but all the other wireless devices we have in our homes. And so if we're concerned about reducing our exposure to radio frequency emissions, what we want to do is reduce the power level needed by the devices we have our hands on to connect to the network. And that's exactly what 5G does. And
That's right, and I mean, it's not just the distance, which I think is important. It's also the fact that, as you know, I mean, small cells, the sort of the devices, the small sort of backpack-sized devices, much smaller than the large macro towers that we used for previous generations of wireless technology. That those operate primarily on millimeter length spectrum,
right.
millimeter wave spectrum, which as you know, is not even capable of penetrating human skin.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it literally bounces off. I mean, it's
right.
So when companies like Verizon that offer a home broadband service based on 5G, when they hook that up, they actually have to put an antenna on your house to pick up the signal from the tower, and then it comes into the house on a wire, because the native millimeter wave signals just don't penetrate walls and enter houses.
Right, right. And I think something else that consumers might not know is that a lot of their devices, like cell phones, they're not always transmitting on the highest possible power. They are smart enough, sophisticated enough that if you're not using it, you got it on a table, you don't have it, close to you, they will, they'll stop transmitting, or at least be transmitting on a lower power setting. And so they're always safe.
Most of the time they're asleep. I mean, if you're not actively using it, the phone goes to sleep. It wakes up every second, or in some cases a small fraction of a second, just to make sure that the network knows which tower it's connected to, and that uses a little bit of housekeeping. So yeah,
Right.
it's asleep 98% of the time. It wakes up, says, "Hi, I'm here. I'm still here. And if you got a call, let me know." And yeah, they're not that they have to do that for battery life. If
Right.
it was, if it was on and power and transmitting at full strength the way the truthers say they are, your battery would last like 10 seconds. So,
Right.
Yeah. And these things are really, it's exceptionally, they're exceptionally well engineered, and all of these things, I get a chuckle out of, when I hear the people who are all skeptical about 5G and radios in general make recommendations for how phones should be redesigned so that they only emit like away from the body, and say, we've been doing that for 20 years. I mean, this is not, you're not the first person to observe that there's no real value in sending radio waves into the brain. There's no tower in there.
Right, right.
Mm.
Right, and that's why, I mean,
Yeah.
we have a great team in the Office of Engineering Technology at the FCC, some of them with, years or decades of experience, and we rely on those, expert engineers to evaluate this equipment and give it the FCC seal of approval.
Well, there's, they're not really, if anything, they're more conservative than the other international regulatory body. You guys are more conservative than the Europeans and the East Asians are. And so and there is a really broad and deep consensus in the community that is concerned about radio frequencies and health, that we have the right approach to the problem. And it is certainly the case that all the agencies that evaluate this question are always looking at the new research. I mean, there's the EMF portal in Germany that has an index of something like 33,000 papers on the frequency, on the health effects of electromagnetic frequency emissions, both in the really low range up to the millimeter range. It's all there. And
Right.
the FDA, part of their process in reviewing, 5G was they went through all the relevant papers from the last 10 years, looking for anything that would provide any clue that 5G was going to create some novel problems that we hadn't anticipated. And there's just nothing there. And they've all
Yeah.
looked at, the studies that are most commonly cited by the cynics, or the NTP study, the Ramazzini Institute study. They look at all that
Right.
stuff, and they examine it in excruciating detail and tell you exactly which findings, are likely causal and which ones are more likely chance. And there certainly is. That's the whole point of replication, is that you do one small study of a limited population, and you're liable to find all kinds of things.
Right. No, and it's a great resource, and we explicitly relied upon the FDA's finding in our most recent order. And I think they've got as you say, 100+ page analysis of all of the reports, both the animal studies as well as the epidemiological studies, from I think 2008 to the present. And it's just you can go on the FDA's website if you're just casually curious. They've got a great overview. If you really want to get into the weeds, they've got they've got all of the research to back it up. So it's really a great service to people who are interested in this.
Yeah, I really like the work that the IEEE Standards Association has done on this too. People don't understand IEEE Standards Association. That's the group that makes the rules for Wi-Fi and all that. And they have a specific task force that works on RF safety. And the people on that task force are largely MDs and PhDs in physiology and public health. And they come up with the specific numbers, because those guys are actually, it's the committee's a combination of medical professionals and electrical engineers. And so they actually have a realistic perspective on what the risks are, how to test for them, and how to evaluate, things as they may change. And it's they're doing great work on this. And FDA, IEEE, FCC, the European Commission, they've all reviewed these questions within the last 2 years. So this is fresh research that really comprehends 5G. So I guess we're probably about time to start wrapping up. So what's up next? I noticed that you filed a statement of interest in a case between CTIA and the city of Berkeley, where Berkeley wanted to put a warning label on phones, and I thought it was a great. I'm gonna put it on the website, because it's a great, concise summary of the FCC's role in evaluating safety and the various legal dictates and all that. But what do you expect to happen in Berkeley? And finally, is there anything we can do? I think in the municipality where I live, since January, there's been a really active discussion going on about the small cell siting ordinance, in which I think finally the council and the advocates for more stringent regulations, they understand the city doesn't have the authority to second guess the FCC's judgment on the health and safety side. So I think what they're trying to do is use aesthetics as a crutch to impose restrictions on the density of towers, which will actually, as we've said, going to hurt their people more than it'll help them. So what can we do about municipalities? And I think they're the battleground, because you're least likely to find a really educated, policy analyst at the city council level than you are at any other level of government. What do we do about people, hijacking the aesthetic rules to advance their safety agenda?
Sure, no, that's a great question. So, I think in terms of what we've been doing at the state and local level, one is, what we've been spending this podcast talking about is sort of educating about RF. We did participate in that City of Berkeley case earlier this week, basically because, we want to send the message that the FCC has determined that the information that's available on its own website, as well as in user manuals and the FCC certification, the stamp on the back of the cell phone, that can assure consumers that their devices are safe. What Berkeley wants to do is to put what it wants is for retailers, and this ordinance has been around since 2015, to essentially announce at the storefront that if you put your phone in your pocket or in your bra or basically against the body, that you could be exceeding federal guidelines, essentially meaning your phone could be unsafe. But that's not how it works. I mean, we
Yeah, I
have
like the weasel word. They say may
right,
exceed.
exactly. And the thing is, we have different
An asteroid
measuring.
may fall on my head today.
Well, that's right. I guess anything could happen, but we have different testing distances, different separation, different distances to ensure safety. But that doesn't mean that that the phone becomes unsafe if you put it up against the body. So RF education is a big thing. You also mentioned that this problem of aesthetics or the misuse of aesthetics on the local level. So we have put out a number of orders. The first one, most recently, a couple of weeks ago, in which we have taken actions to try to preempt and streamline state and local review of 5G deployments. And one thing that we did put in place was to say that you can't use aesthetics simply as an excuse for any type of delay or prohibition of 5G, that your aesthetic requirements need to be reasonable. It needs to be consistent with how you're sort of treating the neighboring environment. You can't just say, well, we don't want 5G in our town, and that's because we don't like how 5G looks. Mm-hmm. So, we get a lot of pushback from certain localities that are averse to federal preemption on this front. I do want to say, so we've got litigation out in the Ninth Circuit right now that's pending, that was argued back in February, and we're waiting on a decision on that, on the aesthetic side. But, we also have a lot of really good state and local partners. I mean, as you point out, there are these model bills, model small cell bills that in some places either mirror the federal approach or even stricter in terms of the limitations that it puts on municipalities for preventing 5G. And so we have a lot of really good state and local partners out there, but we need to keep getting the message out there and trying to identify those areas where people are using aesthetics, people are using fees that exceed reasonable costs. People are unnecessarily delaying the processing of applications. Or what we just did last month, which was, or actually earlier this month, which was to reform and clarify the rules surrounding modifications of existing structures. So as you're well aware, the 5G small cells themselves are not entirely going to get the job done. We're still going to need to rely on those older generations of networks for sort of the backbone of the system. And so what we did is make it easier for folks to make modifications to existing wireless facilities in order to update
perfectly sensible.
5G.
Yeah, it doesn't change the overall aesthetics or the land use or any of the safety parameters. That's great.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of weird because we have a state law in Colorado that essentially, echoes the federal law about siting and permitting, but the attitude of some of the members of the council is sort of, you're not the boss of me. So even though you're telling me to eat my kale because it's good for me, I'm just not going to do it because I don't like being bossed around. So, and I think that's a lovely Colorado spirit that probably had a lot to do with this state becoming the first one to legalize recreational marijuana. Even though I think most of the people who voted to do that have probably never, never got high in their whole life. They just sort of didn't like the idea of being told what to do. So, I don't know, it's the kind of thing that turns teenagers into Ayn Rand libertarians. But, what do you mean, clean my room? You're not the boss of me. Well, actually, we'll see.
Well, and one of the things we tried to accomplish with this order, because I think we appreciated, we're not going to be able to take not every one of these cases is going to be resolved by litigation,
Right.
but we were hoping to sort of arm providers with tools that, as they negotiate with these cities on the local level, that they'll have the order as sort of something that they will have in their hands to be able to say, look, the federal agency
Yeah.
responsible for this has
Mm-hmm.
essentially said, you need to process this application in 60 days. So
Mm-hmm.
let's work something out. Let's come to some sort of agreement. And tentatively, while some cases have gone to court, we are seeing promising results on the ground of people coming together to sort of hash out agreements that are both going to enable 5G as well as take into account the concerns of the local community.
Well, I think the good thing about these disputes, like the one that's been going on for almost 6 months now, is that it actually serves as kind of an educational exercise. And I think people, what it really comes down to is the fear of 5G and the fear of new technology in general is just fear of the unknown. And as people come to understand that, what the actual situation is and appreciate the value of it and how thoroughly all these systems are assessed for health impacts and the overall, I think actually the integrity overall of the whole system, then I think that actually does eventually. They don't necessarily admit right on the spot that you've convinced them that something they believe to be true is not really true, but it sinks in and eventually they go, okay, I'm not going to worry about this. There's enough, I've got enough to do to it, without this. And so I think maybe the industry, and to a lesser extent the government, hasn't done as good a job in outreach and education and promoting a greater understanding as they might have. But it's kind of hard for them to do that because they're always kind of considered suspect. I mean, like the way Monsanto is, because they like to make money, even though they do it by feeding people. But yeah, I think actually these are opportunities to help people develop a better understanding, and so I think it's worthwhile to participate in.
Well,
So
I think
yeah.
I was just going to say, Richard, I mean, I think I can't think of a worse misinformation campaign in the technology space than you had 2 years ago when people forecast that the internet was going to come to an end. When Chairman Pai and the Commission repealed the Title II net neutrality rules, and we just came up against the 2-year anniversary of our light touch approach to broadband regulation coming into effect in June of 2018. But there you see, I mean, I think a lot of the hysteria that you see early on has died down somewhat as people have realized that their internet still works, that in fact, internet speeds now are faster than ever. You don't have
a lot faster.
Right. You're not paying $1 per tweet, as some people suggested was going to happen. And so, I think this really shows that experience, education, just the passage of time can sort of help to really educate the public as to what the truth of the matter is on these things. And so I hope to see that continuing to happen when it comes to some of the concerns that people are raising about 5G.
Yeah, I've been really happy to see the people who were really making the most noise about the internet one word at a time thing, and net neutrality was the be all and end all of internet policy. They've dropped the issue and they're focusing more on the digital divide, on inclusion, on rural broadband, and subsidized broadband to poor people. And these are like the issues that Chairman Pai put front and center when he took office, like the closing the digital divide was the number one priority. And it turns out that is probably the most important issue, one of the most important issues before the FCC at any particular time. It's great to see that.
Well, that's absolutely right. And, the real irony surrounding the net neutrality repeal, which was that some of the strongest voices on our side were the small wireless providers, the small businesses that were sometimes the only option for people out in rural America. And what they were telling us was that, we can't afford to pay for the lawyers, to have the regulatory and legal uncertainty that would come with Title II regulation, and not knowing, how we can update or change our networks. What's a reasonable network practice? What is going to be prohibited under this approach? And so they were very much on our side in repealing those rules. And so, that's just another example of sort of sometimes that law of unintended consequences.
Yeah. One of the interesting things that happened early in the pandemic is there's a small telephone network operator that provides the dial-in service for Zoom. And they were exempted from a bunch of Title II regulations on telephone operators because of their small size. I mean, they really are operating a telephone service. So there's not any question it's a Title II service. But yeah, they had to get a waiver from the FCC because the number of customers they were serving and the number of lines and calls they were handling skyrocketed. With the expansion of Zoom, they no longer met the definition of a small business and had to comply with the full suite of regulations.
Right, and I mean,
Title II doesn't even work for telephone networks, let alone for broadband. Yeah.
Well, this is why in a lot of areas, I mean, what Chairman Pai has tried to put in place is essentially, permissionless innovation, right? Because, the more that entities need to come to us for waivers, the more that entities need to petition us for rulemaking changes, the less innovation we're going to have. Because, I mean, as a federal gatekeeper, I mean, we move slowly. I mean, it's just the nature of the beast, and there's just a lot, the lot that we have on our plates. And so the more that, we can sort of, enable innovators and entrepreneurs to work without government permission. I mean, and right? I mean, one of the greatest success stories is the increasing use of unlicensed spectrum, and how that enabled developments like Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. And, it wasn't the government, coming up with those things. And,
even 5G is going to use some unlicensed, new radio unlicensed.
Sure.
It's one of the modes. Yeah.
Sure.
I mean, somebody's got to use that 1200 megahertz of spectrum, of unlicensed spectrum the commission recently released. It's amazing.
Yeah, no, that's right. And so, we're very happy about, we're very happy about that order. And, we've got a litigation challenge that was just filed, but, we feel good about the legal analysis in the order. And, I think that the more that we do that sort of unlicensed or sort of flexible use spectrum, I think the better the American economy is. I mean, when the FCC historically has taken bets on this spectrum's better for broadcast, this spectrum's going to be better for, we don't really, want FM radio. We just want AM radio. Or, the ideas behind cellular phone technology, for example. There's a Saturday Evening Post article, I think 1947, 1949. But the approvals from the FCC just took a very long time because the commission thought that more spectrum was needed for broadcast. And so,
I think that's one of the things that Tom Hazlett covers in his book.
Yeah, in his book.
Spectrum, yeah. The FCC was really blind throughout the 50s to the value of cell phones. And in fact, I discovered cell phones as a common thing in the mid 80s when I lived in Singapore for a while. It's like, what do you mean? I mean, we have cell phones, we have fax machines. Like, what are you guys doing? You're supposed to be this advanced, technological powerhouse. But I think the original guess was that, you wouldn't need more than about 3 mobile phones per city.
They were off by a couple.
Yeah, a few orders of magnitude. But I mean, it's like what Thomas Watson famously said, that, there'd only be a market for like 6 or 7 computers.
Yeah. Wow.
Kind of underestimated the capability of computers to generate information that you need other computers to process.
Right.
Yes, it's kind of, chain reaction type thing. Yeah. So thanks a lot. Yeah. And
oh, sure.
I'm gonna share this widely. It's going to be on the High Tech Forum hightechforum.org, and I'll upload a copy to YouTube and probably put it on Facebook and get it out there to as wide an audience as I possibly can. I'm finding a lot more people are willing to do podcasts now, since like that's just sort of the normal way we communicate.
Right.
It's not really much of a change in anybody's day. So I've got some interesting guests lined up. And if if you happen to run into the chairman, whisper in his ear that it's time for us to do another podcast.
Okay, I will definitely do so. And thanks so much for the invitation. I really enjoyed the discussion.
Yeah, it's been great. Well,
all right.
All right. So there you have it, folks. Check back next week and maybe we'll have another podcast for you to see. Might even be about the Open Radio Access Network software for 5G. Who knows? Well, so
sounds great.
Yep. Signing off.
Take care, Richard.
Bye.
Okay, thanks. Well,